The cave floor was cold against your bare feet. The torchlight threw shadows that moved like living things. You could smell the damp limestone, the ash of old fires, the animal fat burning in the clay lamp. And there, on the wall, painted in ochre and charcoal, a shape that should not exist. A body that is part man, part beast. Antlers spreading like branches. Eyes that follow you from every angle. Your ancestors stood exactly where you are standing now, performing this ritual for generations before recorded history began. They did not paint this creature because they were bored. They painted it because they believed it was watching them. And they were not stupid. They were not superstitious in the way we use that word to dismiss them. They knew something you do not, something modern neuroscience is only beginning to confirm. The monster on that cave wall is not a fantasy. It is a self-portrait of the human brain. And here's the first thing they understood that you have forgotten. The darkness is not empty. If that shift in perspective unsettled you, if the possibility that your ancestors were not naive but instead seeing something you have been trained to ignore, then you know exactly why this channel exists. This is the kind of map we redraw here, not of geography, but of the mind's own hidden architecture. Subscribe if you want to keep walking through the cave with us, because we are only a few feet in, and the paintings get stranger the deeper we go. And when you do, drop the word ochre in the comments, the pigment your ancestors used to make the monster visible, because I want to know how many of you felt the shift as you read that sentence. There is a creature that appears in nearly every human culture, separated by oceans and millennia, with no contact between the peoples who described it. It goes by many names. The Navajo call it the skinwalker. In the Philippines, it is the aswang. Norse berserkers wore its pelt. European folk tales call it the werewolf. The details vary, but the core is the same. A human being who can become an animal, or an animal that wears a human shape. The boundary between species is permeable. This belief is so ancient that it predates agriculture. In the caves of Trois Frères in France, there is a figure known as the sorcerer, painted over 15,000 years ago, with the antlers of a stag, the ears of an owl, the tail of a horse, and the legs of a man. The image is not a decoration. It is a fixed point in the history of human consciousness. The werewolf is not a fable passed down from a medieval writer who had too much ergot in his bread. It is a fossil of how our ancestors understood the self. The official story is simple. Modern science tells us that monsters are fictional. They are inventions of the pre-scientific mind, used to explain what could not be explained. Lightning was a god. Epilepsy was demonic possession. The howl in the night was a wolf, and the imagination turned it into a monster. We know better now. We have fMRI machines and germ theory and carbon dating. We understand that the werewolf is a metaphor for the animal inside us, the id, the primal urge that civilization keeps in check. Carl Jung called it the shadow. Joseph Campbell called it the hero's journey. And all of this is true, but it is not the complete truth. It is the surface layer, the explanation that makes us feel smarter than our ancestors. And that feeling of intellectual superiority is exactly what keeps us from seeing what is actually happening. Here's what nobody noticed. When you show a human infant a picture of a snake, even if that infant has never seen a real snake, their pupils dilate and their heart rate increases. They do not know what a snake is. They have never been bitten. But their brain recognizes the threat pattern. This is called prepared learning, and it was demonstrated by the psychologist Arne Oman in a series of experiments in the 1970s and 1980s. Oman found that humans become afraid of snakes and spiders far more easily than they become afraid of cars or guns, even though cars and guns are statistically more dangerous. The fear is pre-wired. It is a survival advantage that was etched into the nervous system over millions of years of evolution, long before there were words to describe it. But here's the strange part. In Oman's fMRI studies, the amygdala, the almond-shaped cluster of neurons that processes fear, responded just as strongly to ambiguous shapes that resembled snakes as it did to actual snakes. A coil of rope in the grass, a shadow moving in the periphery. The brain did not wait for confirmation. It interpreted the ambiguous signal as a predator, because in the ancestral environment, it was better to mistake a stick for a snake than a snake for a stick. The cost of a false positive was a moment of unnecessary fear. The cost of a false negative was death. Think about that. Your brain, right now, is scanning the world for threats you have never encountered. It is using a template that was designed for the Pleistocene, and that template includes a category for something that does not exist in the modern world. A predator. Something that hunts you. Something that can see you even when you cannot see it. The rational mind says there are no such predators in your bedroom, but the amygdala does not care what the rational mind says. It is older than language. It is older than your sense of self. And when the lights go out, when the floor creaks, when you feel that cold prickle on the back of your neck, it is not your rational mind that responds. It is the lizard brain. And the lizard brain believes that something is in the room with you, but the evidence goes deeper. In the 1970s, the folklorist David Hufford began documenting cases of a phenomenon that occurs during sleep paralysis. The experience is remarkably consistent across cultures. The sleeper wakes, unable to move, and feels a presence in the room. Sometimes the presence is malevolent, sometimes it sits on the chest, pressing the air out of the lungs. In Newfoundland, it is called the Old Hag. In Japan, it is Kanashibari. In Zulu culture, it is Isipoki. The details change, but the core experience is identical. A modern neuroscientist would say that sleep paralysis is a glitch in the sleep-wake cycle. The body remains in REM atonia while the mind wakes up. The hallucination of the intruder is a misinterpretation of the brain's own arousal signals. And this is correct, but it is not the whole story, because the brain does not just invent any hallucination. It invents a specific one, a predator, an intruder, a presence that watches you while you are helpless. This is not a random error, it is a structured response, a threat simulation that the brain runs when it detects a vulnerable state. The mechanism is ancient. Huffer documented hundreds of cases across dozens of cultures, and in every one the hallucination followed the same pattern. The brain was not creating a monster, it was remembering one. Here is where the real machinery shows itself. In 2009, the neuroscientist Marina Hajikani published a study on pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in random patterns. She found that the fusiform face area, a region of the brain dedicated to face recognition, activates just as strongly when people look at ambiguous patterns like clouds or burnt toast as it does when they look at actual faces. The brain is so hungry for faces that it will manufacture them from noise. And this is not a bug, it is a feature. A face in the bushes might be a predator. A face in the cave might be a rival. The cost of missing a real face is higher than the cost of seeing a fake one. So the brain errs on the side of seeing too many faces. And when those faces appear in the dark, when the ambiguity is at its maximum, the brain does not just see a face, it sees a monster, because the monster is the face of the predator. It is the face of the thing that hunted your ancestors in the savannah, the thing that could climb trees and hide in shadows and wait in silence. The brain does not know that the predator is extinct. It is still looking for it. And in the absence of real data, it will paint one. But the most unsettling evidence comes from the children. In a series of studies conducted by Stanley Reichmann in the 1970s, children aged 2 to 4 were asked if monsters were real. A majority said yes. They described the monsters in detail. They knew where monsters lived, what they wanted, and how to avoid them. The parents, of course, said that monsters were not real, but the children did not believe them. Why? Because the fear of monsters appears too early to be learned. Infants show fear of looming objects by 6 months. Toddlers show fear of the dark by 18 months. These fears are present across cultures, even in societies where parents do not tell stories about monsters. The fear is innate, it is part of the developmental program, and it disappears around age 7 when the prefrontal cortex matures enough to override the amygdala's default settings. But it does not disappear completely. It is suppressed, buried, and in the right circumstances it returns. A lucid dream, a panic attack, a moment of profound isolation. The monster is still there. It has only been waiting. Now, pause here. Think about what this means. You were taught that monsters are a phase of childhood, a story we tell to explain the unexplained. You were taught that your ancestors believed in monsters because they were ignorant of science, but the evidence says the opposite. The fear of monsters is not a product of culture. It is a product of evolution. It is hardwired into the architecture of your brain, present before you could speak, present before you could understand the concept of fiction. The monster is not a story you learned. It is a story you were born knowing. And that means it is not something you can simply outgrow. It is something you learn to ignore. And ignoring a survival mechanism is not the same as dismantling it. You have made it this far with me, past the official story, and into the neural pathways themselves. That takes a certain kind of mind, one that is willing to hold both the science and the mystery in the same hand. If that is your mind, then subscribe. This channel exists for people who refuse to let intellectual comfort erase the weight of ancestral memory. We are peeling back the veneer of civilization, one skull at a time, and I want to know you are part of this archaeology. And in the comments, leave the word prefrontal, the part of the brain that learns to override the monster, because I want to see how many of you recognize that battle between your 7-year-old self and your adult self, still being fought in the dark. So let us return to the cave wall. The sorcerer in the cave of Trois Frères was not a work of imagination. It was a diagram of the brain's fear architecture, painted by people who did not have the vocabulary to describe the amygdala or the fusiform face area, but who knew the experience intimately. They knew that the boundary between human and animal was thin. They knew that the darkness contained a presence that watched them. They knew that the fear was real, and they were right. They were right in a way that we, in our intellectual arrogance, have forgotten how to be. They did not dismiss the fear as irrational. They honored it. They gave it a shape, a name, a ritual. They integrated it into their understanding of the world, and in doing so they kept themselves alive, generation after generation, in an environment that was filled with real predators. The therapist calls this a phobia. The shaman calls it memory. When your pulse quickens in a dark room, it is not panic. It is your ancestors' eyes, still watching the cave mouth for what stalks them. The creature on the wall was never separate from you. It was you. It is the part of your brain that remembers what it means to be prey. And the question is not whether the monster is real. The question is what it means to live in a world where you carry this fear inside you, a fear that no amount of rational explanation can erase, a fear that is, in its own way, true, because the fear is not the monster. The fear is the signal, and the signal is pointing at something that has been real for every human who ever lived. The signal is pointing at the dark, and the dark, in a way we rarely admit, is not empty. It is full of possibilities. It is full of the unknown. And the human brain, the brain that survived the Pleistocene, the brain that built cities and wrote laws and split the atom, still does not know how to be comfortable with that uncertainty. It still fills the darkness with shapes. It still feels the weight of eyes that are not there. And that is not a flaw. It is a legacy. We are almost at the cave mouth, but the paintings are still speaking. If you want to know what other creatures are hiding in the neural architecture, the ones we have yet to name, you need to subscribe, not for notifications, for the ritual, for the signal that you are willing to see the full gallery of the mind's dark museum. Because the next painting is not a monster, it is something older. And right now, before the credits roll and the torchlight fades, drop one last word in the comments. Trois frères, the cave that proves our ancestors painted the brain before we knew how to look inside it. So when you feel that prickle on your neck tonight, when your breath catches and your eyes scan the shadows, do not tell yourself it is nothing. Do not dismiss it as irrational. Your ancestors knew what that feeling meant. Your brain remembers. The question is not whether the monster is real. The monster is as real as the neural pathways that generate it. The real question is what else you are still capable of seeing that you have been taught not to believe. The cave is full of paintings you have never looked at closely, and some of them are of creatures that have not finished revealing themselves.